Hey guys, it's Libby. As you may know, I've been on a hiatus for a couple of weeks. I'm basically doing a hiatus from all social media. I occasionally pop into Twitter just to watch it sort of melt and burn. So I guess I'm taking a hiatus from all social media except for the most trashy one. But overall, I gotta say I am enjoying it, but I wanted to pop back in here. I wanted to say that I'm not dead, and also to post a video here that I had originally posted on my costuming channel. It's just about the only video I had posted on my costuming channel, so I figured it's the video I've put the most work into ever, so I wanted to stick it over here on my main channel. I filmed it during the Jane Austen July of 2020, and in it I attempt to live like a Jane Austen character for a day and see how that goes. I hope you enjoy. Good morning, everyone. It's Libby. Today I'm going to be sharing my attempt to live like a Jane Austen character for a day, so like a Regency gentlewoman. I'm gonna start by scrubbing my face. So they didn't have like wet washes yet. You didn't wash with water. You just scrubbed very vigorously. This was the standard way of washing that had been around for centuries, and wet washes aren't going to become popular for another couple of decades. To get dressed, I start with my footwear because it's easier to get that on before you have your stays on. So I'm wearing silk stockings, knitted garters, and some lace-up shoes. I got these shoes from Target, but they're actually quite historically accurate. Then I get on my chemise and start to lace up my stays. These are a flat-fronted transitional stay, so they are typical of the end of the 18th century and the very beginning of the 19th century. They were only really fashionable for a very short period of time, from like 1797 to 1798, but you do find them worn unfashionably, so by like the working classes, for a longer span of time. And these stays are made from Past Patterns transitional stay pattern, which I will link below. Next layer is my petticoat, which is a linen petticoat with a cotton half bodice. And then I put on my chemisette, which is like a sort of tiny amount of shirt which fills in the neckline. My petticoat is self-drafted, and my chemisette is based on one in the American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking. Then it's time to put on my dress. This is made of cotton from a Colonial Williamsburg replica print, so it's a replica of an 18th century floral print, and it's lined in linen. This is another Past Patterns pattern. I think it's called their Lewis and Clark era gown, which I have adapted to have a drop front or an apron front as opposed to a front closure, a front tie closure. So the lining closes in the front, that's what holds the back in place, and then you button the bib to the buttons I have added, and you tie the rest of the skirts behind your back. So this is overall a fairly early Regency look. This sort of outfit would be fashionable in 1797 to 1798. I know that's not the actual political Regency in England, which started in 1811, but in the historical costuming world, we use Regency to basically mean the high-waisted period. So in terms of Jane Austen's life, this is from around the time period when she was working on early drafts of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, and it's also when she wrote Northanger Abbey. With the exception of Persuasion, we don't have a really clear picture of what year Jane Austen's novels are set in, but based on the fashion and literary cues that I'm getting from Northanger Abbey, I think that that novel is meant to be set in the late 1790s. I don't have actual bangs, as was fashionable in the early 19th century, so I'm sort of trying to fake it with my shorter bits of front hair. So I curled them very tightly, and maybe a little bit too tightly. Fortunately, caps can hide many sins. Now, I am not being aided by a servant, which would have been a big part of the English upper-class life in the Georgian era. But in many cases, even members of the landed gentry and the nobility were not absolutely waited on hand and foot at every single moment of the day. Jane Austen herself was responsible for making breakfast in her household, so I will be doing that later today. And I am living in a modern house with modern conveniences, so I have an oven that heats automatically, I have running water, I have lights that turn on without me having to light candles, and of course I have washing machines for dishes and for clothes. So a lot of work that historically would have been done by servants is now done by robots. So aside from a brief bit of cooking that I'm going to have to do later in the day, this is actually a fairly plausible amount of work that someone would be doing herself. And finally, I'm putting on a little bit of makeup. This is just Burt's Bees Lip Shimmer in Rhubarb, which is a tinted lip balm. I use it to get a sheer lip coverage, and I also put a little bit on my cheeks. Makeup was not vilified in the Georgian era. That's more of a Victorian thing. And now I am getting out my computer, not a historically accurate item, but one of the things women would often do in the mornings was address their correspondence. And I am not engaged in any letter writing relationships, so checking my correspondence for me means checking my email. At least in my life, I can't really get away with not checking my email for 24 hours. So this is definitely a modern approximation of what an actual Georgian gentlewoman would have been doing. Okay, so I am now all done with breakfast. Surprisingly, it was not hard to spend an hour eating. After breakfast was done, the lady of the house would attend to some sort of domestic things, consulting with the cook about what dinner was going to be. My version of that was starting dinner. So I'm cooking, I've adapted a recipe from an 1810 cookbook to be done in the slow cooker. So I've started that. Now I'm going to tend to my garden, by which I mean water my one basil and chive plant. And then I'm going to sort of settle in for the rest of the day. And then at like 4 o'clock is when I'm going to start the transition into evening. And now Nova and I are getting into the main business of the day, which for me is going to be some small textile arts, and then reading, because I am technically doing this as part of the Jane Austen July Readathon. So I'm going to settle in with Persuasion. I'm maybe not going to be having the most typical Regency day. Oh, you're going to sit right on the ball of yarn? I'm maybe not having the most typical Regency day because I am not vaccinated yet. I live in a small country and we're not prioritized to get the vaccine. So I'm getting my first vaccine next week. So this is going to be a all indoors, no guests version of a Regency day. So during the bulk of the day, or what Georgians would call the morning, which is any time before dinner, and dinner could be like starting from 2 to 6. The later, the more fashionable. We are planning to dine at 5, so we're fairly fashionable. We had breakfast at 10, which is a fairly late breakfast hour. And basically, the more you progress into the day towards dinner, the more sort of open to the public you are. So if you are spending the day at home expecting to be visited rather than to go out and visit people, you would start the day with, you would start the morning with activities that you don't want other people to see as much. So I'm doing my knitting earlier in the day, which is not as prestigious as maybe hat decoration, which I'll probably move into after this, embroidery, or reading. And I actually think it's pretty unlikely that a woman of the gentry would be knitting at all, especially this garment. So what I'm making here is a mitt. It's like a long sleeve, it's a long glove with no fingers. They're bigger in the 18th century than in the 19th century, and they're actually more often made of fabric rather than knit. I'll leave a link to the Ravelry page for this pattern in the description. This is actually based mainly on what an 18th century stocking would have looked like, because some people, when their stocking toe or heel wore out, you would cut off the foot and turn it into an arm warmer. So I've got this sort of pseudo seam running down what would have been the back of the leg. This is very interesting. This sort of back seam on stockings had hung around since the Middle Ages, when stockings actually had to be seamed because they were made of woven fabric. They weren't knitted. And so you would do a seam up the back, and I guess people either stylistically liked it or wanted to look like their stockings were out of woven material rather than knitted material. But by the early 1900s, mitts were pretty much out of fashion, and even when mitts were in fashion, only the less fashionable ones would have been knitted, and even stockings, if you're making a mitt from a stocking, would not have been knitted by hand. The stocking, like the mechanical stocking knitter, had been invented in, I think, the 17th century. It's not like a fully mechanized process, but you can sort of turn a wheel and it does all the stitches, so you just sort of have to pay attention to like when to undo some loops for the decreases or add some loops for the increases. So if for some reason a Jane Austen character was doing some knitting, she would want to do it earlier in the day so that only good friends who wouldn't judge her would see her doing any knitting. And I think for the most part she would be more likely to be doing embroidery, but I didn't have any Regency era embroidery projects on the go. I have my Tudor blackwork sampler, but it seemed more right to be knitting than to be doing 15th century or 16th century embroidery. So I did about an hour of knitting. Got through maybe 9 or 10 rounds. I don't know, you're supposed to decrease every 5 rounds and I only decreased once. So hopefully less than 10 rounds. So I think, now it's possible that someone might interrupt me and I can't let them know that I'm knitting. So I'm going to pick up with where I left off in Persuasion yesterday. I'm going to be starting with chapter 6. Okay, now I'm going to try the lemonade. This is based on a German recipe from the 1790s. I found it at Pavillon de la Paix, the blog. I will leave a link down below. It is in German, but Google Translate is your friend, so Prost. This is pretty intense lemonade. I wanted to do homemade lemonade rather than buying it because one, trying old recipes is always fun. No one wants to know which part of the duck is for her. Do you want some of that fat? I'll leave it here for you. So yeah, I did want to try some historic recipes. This one was interesting because it called for he said 1 pint of water, and then in parentheses, a pint is equal to 1.5 pounds. So one of those measurements is different from modern measurements because in modern measurements, a pint is a pound. And so I wasn't really sure which one to go with. And then I looked at how much sugar he wanted me to add, and I was like, that's a lot of sugar. So I went for the 1.5 pints, so 3 cups. And I think that was definitely the right choice because if I had, 1/3 less water in here, this would be really intense. But it's still pretty good. I mean, I'm drinking the whole thing. Now, luncheon is a pretty interesting meal. It's kind of new in the Regency era. If you look at the history of at least Western Europe, possibly more of Europe, over the past, or at least from like 1450 to 1850, it's basically the story of dinner getting moved later and later. So in the Middle Ages, dinner was the first meal of the day and you ate it around 11. Then for various reasons, it kept getting pushed back and back and back, and people were like, I can't wait until 4 p.m. to eat. So we were sort of inventing all of these new meals to go before it. So you get breakfast, and then we moved dinner back later. So now people are starting to eat lunch. Now, I've seen some secondary sources describing luncheon as a meal that only occurred while people were traveling. And I think there's like an interesting nuance there that isn't getting quite paid enough attention to. And that is that it was a meal when you were traveling. But on days when people weren't traveling, they still just ate some food and didn't consider it to be a meal. So like if you're in a carriage for 6 hours, getting out, finding an inn, probably freshening up, ordering some food, that has sort of all of the trappings of a meal. And I think when people were staying at home or at somebody else's home, they would just get some food. So I was actually just reading in Persuasion the description of someone eating not at a mealtime, and it's very sort of like offhand. So after Anne has arrived at her sister Mary's house, she describes what Mary is doing when they're about to set off on a visit. Austen says of Mary that then, forgetting to think of it, she was at the other end of the room beautifying a nosegay, then she ate her cold meat, and then she was well enough to propose a little walk. And that scene is not taking place like in a dining room or a breakfast room. It's probably in a drawing room or a parlor. And yeah, Mary just like has a quick thing to eat. Anne is not eating with her. I think people just sort of got hungry between breakfast, which is at 9 or 10, and dinner, which could be as late as 5. So it's interesting that people are like acknowledging that they need to eat, but not feeling the need to sort of make it a scheduled part of the day. You also really didn't want lunch to be a big affair because everyone working in the kitchen, which could be your servants or could be you, needs to be focusing on dinner, the main meal of the day. So salad, super easy to prepare, and then I'm having cold duck, having cold meat from whatever the main dish was from last night's dinner was often a big part of luncheon. So I just bought some smoked duck, but I was sort of imagining that yesterday for dinner we had a roast duck, and now I'm just having leftovers of it. So it's now a little bit before 4 o'clock. which means I'm going to get ready to make my day to evening transition. We're eating at 5, but I think I have to like do some actual cooking. I'm going to have to be a Georgian cook for a little bit before I can return to being a Georgian lady. And since I'm going to change into more formal attire for the evening, I think I'm just going to take off all my outer clothes, put a t-shirt on top, make dinner, and then get dressed in my evening clothes. I just really don't want to risk getting food on any of the clothes that I worked really hard to make. So we've now, as you can see, moved on to after dinner tea and games. I think normally the genders would separate again after dinner, and the women would chat and have some tea, and the men would have their cigars and port. I figured since we're just one couple, we wouldn't just sit by ourselves in separate rooms after dinner, so we're just jumping straight into everyone coming together. So we're going to be playing chess. We are going to be playing a non-Regency chess variant, which is Fischer 360, because it's just a lot better than regular chess. It's more strategic and less about memorization. So basically the way it works is you randomize the back rows, and they're even. You randomize them the same way. So you can't just like memorize. It becomes a lot harder to memorize all the positions that something can be in. Yeah, so I'm just waiting for David, and then we are going to pick colors and create our back rows. And if you decide to follow along, we didn't have all the white pieces, so we have 2 little backgammon bits serving as white pawns, and the white king is this peg. While I'm waiting for David to show up, we are also having tea now. You may notice I did not have afternoon tea. I did not have, the meal of tea, tiny sandwiches, scones, and little pastries. Even though this gets put in some Jane Austen adaptations, and places like the Jane Austen Center in Bath offer tea services, afternoon tea is actually a Victorian idea. It was invented in the 1830s. You guessed it, because dinner moved back some more, and so we needed more space between lunch. We needed more food between lunch and dinner. What a true train wreck. I am not the worst at not losing a game of chess, but I am completely incapable of winning a game of chess. Now you may have noticed the computer is back out. For the glamorous and decadent Georgians, dinner was kind of the beginning of the evening festivities. You then could spend some quiet time at home, playing games, drinking tea, talking, potentially reading out loud. I think card games were more popular than chess, but I looked up Regency card games, and it looks like most of them require 4 people. There were a couple that don't. One was 21 or 21, which is basically blackjack with no house. And then there was piquet, which seems like I found 2 YouTube videos explaining how to play piquet. The first one was 7 minutes, and I got completely lost within the first 90 seconds. The second one was 30 minutes, and I was like, I'm not going to dedicate that much time to learning how to play a card game. It's basically, if you're familiar with historical card games at all, basically first you play poker, then you play whist. If you were not some sort of prude and you actually wanted to go out and have some fun, there were a couple different options available to you, especially in London, but also in the other larger cities. Balls, public and private, obviously not vaccinated, and also don't think there are any balls just sort of going on that I could attend at the moment. And the other option is theater, including concerts and opera, so like live performance. So we are going to be watching an opera, and I'm going to leave it up to David which one we are going to do. And I figured this was sort of our best option for a socially distanced approximation of an evening out. I think we're just going to be watching one opera. We might watch 2 short ones. But for theater in the Georgian time and also earlier, it's not unusual to see multiple performances. Like the theater would just have sort of 5 hours worth of entertainment. So you might get a mix of comedies and tragedies for either plays or operas. You also might get long plays or operas with sort of interludes between the acts of small musical performances or very short dramatic works. To sort of give the actors more time to, the main actors or the main opera singers more time off, and to give the audience goers a sort of different taste of something. Also, for the most part, people weren't concerned with spoilers, so knowing what the story of the play or opera was before you went in was perfectly normal. A lot of them were about sort of historical figures, and also Shakespeare was quite popular, and everyone knows the ends of all the Shakespeare plays. So showing up an hour late, watching 1 or 2 acts of whatever's on, and then leaving was a totally appropriate thing that you could do with your time and money. So we've now enjoyed our evening festivities. We did a sad opera, then we did a happy opera. So the theater has left us satisfied with doing all the emotions. So now we are returning to our home, and we're going to have supper. It's after 9 o'clock, but the summer solstice just happened recently, so it's still like completely bright outside. So I feel like, I don't know if people would actually do this, but I'm gonna take off the outer layer because this has a train, and I'm getting kind of tired of having to deal with it all the time. So I feel like back at home, don't need to impress anybody. I'm just gonna wear the dress without the overdress, and then we're gonna eat for the last time, and then I think I'm gonna go to sleep. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Before wrapping up, I wanted to share a couple of things that I learned about living in the Regency era. The first is that they had a lot of excellent food in the Regency era. I will leave either full recipes or links to recipes to as many things as I can in the description down below. I also noticed how much the soft, cushy modern furniture was sort of fighting with my stays. I always felt much more comfortable sitting on the hard dining room chairs than on the couch when I was wearing my stays. I think because the stays are supportive and the hard chair is supportive, but the couch is not supportive. You're meant to relax into it, and if you're getting two different cues to relax and to be supported and sit up straight, the body gets confused, and I found myself sort of collapsing into my collarbone whenever I was trying to sit on the couch. The most surprising thing that I noticed was how lonely it was in the middle of the day. I'm an introvert and I'm quite happy to be alone most of the time, so I really wasn't expecting this. And I think being able to interact with people on the internet as opposed to real life is still very different from not being able to interact with anybody at all. So it gave me a real sense for how exciting a social event would be in the Georgian era, or even in the pre-computer or pre-phone era. Again, thank you so much for watching. Good night.